I was holding a note from my son. I'm picking up Mom from the hospital. We'll be back in a couple of hours. They were supposed to be back 2 hours ago. The phone was silent. I felt something was wrong. I couldn't sit still, knowing something might be off. Without thinking, I grabbed the keys and rushed out of the house. I was driving down the road, the tension building with every mile. The car wasn't moving any faster, despite my attempts to speed up. The streets of the town were empty, the evening sun was setting, and the shadows from the houses grew longer. I was supposed to be getting my life back on track. I thought about how quickly the night would pass, how I would meet Matt and Emily, how I would finally exhale, how everything would return to normal. And then my phone rang. I glanced at the screen, an unknown number. Something inside me shifted, but I answered. Mr. Dunn? The voice on the other end said. Yes, I replied, trying not to sound nervous. This is the police. We have information regarding the car accident your loved ones were involved in. Your son and wife were injured. Please come to the scene immediately. It felt like the ground beneath me vanished. My vision blurred, and I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a stop on the side of the road, and I gripped the steering wheel. No, this can't be, flashed through my mind. What happened to them? I asked, but the voice that responded wasn't what I had expected. It wasn't comforting. It was cold, mechanical, only heightening the fear. Come to the scene. We'll give you more details when you get here. The line went dead. I sat there in the car, not knowing what to do. My mind refused to comprehend what was happening. All I heard was, car accident. Matt and Emily. I saw them in my mind. They were on their way home. Everything was fine. Why? Suddenly, I felt cold sweat on my brow. My heart was racing, and I realized I couldn't stay there. I had to move, not thinking of the consequences. It didn't matter what awaited me, there was only one thing I had to do: find them. I arrived at the scene of the accident in 10 minutes. I immediately spotted several police cars and an ambulance. The scene felt like a nightmare: cars, ambulances, lit only by the faint glow of streetlights. I quickly parked and jumped out of the car, hardly noticing anything around me. A police officer standing next to a vehicle saw me and approached. Are you Benjamin Dunn? He asked without meeting my eyes. Yes, what happened to my family? I snapped, feeling my patience slipping. He nodded and then gestured toward the side of the road. Your loved ones were in the accident. They didn't survive. Those words cut through me. I couldn't believe it. Matt and Emily, they were gone. I tried to understand what was happening, but the words didn't fit in my head. My eyes, all my senses, were clouded. I couldn't miss a single detail. I quickly asked him another question. How did it happen? The officer stepped back and started explaining that the accident occurred at an intersection. My family had been on their way home when their car collided with another. But the details were vague, there were many uncertainties. I stood up and looked at the scene. The ambulance, the police, several cars. It all felt like a nightmare, but reality stood still. I couldn't believe I had lost everything I had. I sat in my room as dark thoughts started to overwhelm me. Matt and Emily were gone. Gone so suddenly that I couldn't understand what had happened. At that moment, when I stood at the scene of the crash, I knew one thing: it wasn't an accident. How many times had I heard that no one was to blame for tragedies? But I saw how it was all being covered up, how the words from the police were taking away my chance to find answers. I couldn't leave it as it was. I had to find the truth. I didn't believe in this ridiculous version that it was just a random accident. Then why not tell the whole truth? Why was I only hearing evasive answers from those who were supposed to protect them? Why had the police ignored the most important details? Who was hiding the truth? All these questions gnawed at me. I was no longer the person who could just sit back and mourn. I couldn't allow myself to be disappointed in the system I once believed in. I knew something wasn't right. I knew my family shouldn't have died due to someone's negligence. It shouldn't have happened. The next morning, I went to the police station. I asked for the case report that had been denied to me, and they wouldn't give it to me at the crash site either. I was ready to do anything. I demanded details, insisted they provide access to the materials. But the officer I spoke to didn't say anything new. He just kept repeating that they did their job, that it was just an ordinary accident. That it was just another case. But in his eyes, I saw that he was hiding something. He gave me no hope for an answer. I could already feel that his words didn't match what I had seen with my own eyes. I realized I couldn't trust this system. No documents, reports, or records would lead me to the truth. I had to find my own way. I began to search for evidence, witnesses, and anyone who could help me. I could feel that no one else would be as invested in investigating this case as I was. My steps became more decisive. I couldn't stop. I started looking for those who could help me uncover the truth. It was hard, but every new step brought me closer to understanding what had happened. And I knew I wouldn't stop until I found the answer. I knew that in order to move forward with the investigation, I needed more than just conversations with the police and observations at the scene. I started gathering all possible evidence. I reached out to people who might know something about the incident, reviewed footage from cameras, and searched for clues online. This wasn't just an investigation, it was a trial. I could feel every step bringing me closer to the truth, but it remained elusive, like fog. Matt and Emily were gone. And that emptiness, that injustice, wouldn't leave me. I couldn't just sit idly by knowing that someone was hiding behind a wall of lies. They deserved more. I deserved answers. The first day, after talking to the neighbor, I managed to find a few people who were also nearby at the time. But they all avoided speaking openly. I started to notice they were all saying the same thing. Just a regular accident, it happens. And I felt that cold sweat on my brow again. It was too suspicious. But I didn't have time for doubts. I knew I needed to act. And act quickly? At one point, I stumbled upon information I hadn't expected to find. It was a report about the driver of the other car being connected to local authorities, people who could influence the investigation. This was confirmation that something was being hidden, and it was something much more serious than I had imagined. At that moment, it became clear to me, the police weren't going to reveal the truth. All these formalities, all these reports, it was a game they were playing. I couldn't just accept that. I realized that there was no other option for me but to act on my own. I decided to search for witnesses, those who could give me what was being concealed. It wasn't easy, but I couldn't stop. Every day I spent looking, trying to find a lead. And finally, I got lucky. One of the taxi drivers, who had been nearby when the crash happened, agreed to share what he had seen. He confirmed that the driver of the other car was acting strangely. He noticed how the driver kept switching lanes, nearly driving into oncoming traffic. It seemed like he was under the influence. I recorded his testimony and immediately handed it over to my lawyer. We began working on getting these testimonies officially involved. This was a step forward, but I knew I needed more. To get to the truth, I had to find concrete evidence. I started gathering information on the driver of that car, his past, his connections, and what might be linked to his possible guilt. Several days passed, and my lawyer informed me that, with the existing data, we could request additional expertise. We needed more evidence that the driver was drunk, not just in shock from the accident. We arranged for alcohol tests and other studies to confirm my suspicions. I couldn't calm down. My internal anxiety wouldn't let go. Every step brought me closer to the answer, and I knew I couldn't let this case stay closed. I found myself thinking more and more about what had been done, and what still needed to be done. I thought about Matt and Emily, how they were driving home, ready to return to normal life. It was so unfair that they became victims of someone's irresponsibility. My nights grew longer, and I found myself waking up from nightmares, reliving that moment when they left. I was reliving their deaths over and over, not knowing how to escape this hellish cycle. One evening, as I sat at the table, going over papers and records, an unexpected call came. It was my lawyer. He said that all the alcohol tests for the driver had been completed. And here's what we discovered: the level of alcohol in his blood was higher than permissible. This person wasn't just guilty. He was drunk behind the wheel, and that was the main cause of the crash. At that moment, I realized my suspicions were correct. I had found what I was looking for. He was drunk. This wasn't a random event. It was a crime that someone had tried to cover up. Now there was only one thing left to do: to take the case to the finish, to get to those who were hiding the truth. The guilty had to be held accountable, and I was ready to do everything to make that happen. Now, when I was certain of my suspicions, I realized how much bigger this case was than just a random accident. I found what I was looking for. The driver was drunk behind the wheel, and it turned out that this wasn't just some random person. This was an influential individual, someone with connections and the ability to hide his guilt. At that moment, I understood that the game was going to be much more complicated than I had imagined. This person wasn't just a driver. He was part of the local political elite, had connections with high-profile people, which allowed him to evade responsibility. He was the kind of person who could use his money and influence to cover up a crime. And now it became clear to me that everything I had seen in the investigation was just an attempt to conceal the truth, to protect him from punishment. This fact shook me. How had I not noticed this sooner? Why hadn't anyone mentioned who was really behind the wheel? I began searching for information about him. His name was linked to several influential people in the area. He had business, ties to local authorities, and now I realized that all of this could have played a role in hiding the truth. This was far from a random incident, and I was certain that his actions should not go unpunished. Knowing now who was behind the wheel, I understood how careful yet resolute I had to be. I couldn't just walk away. With this knowledge, everything became clearer, but also more dangerous. I had a choice: turn a blind eye and allow this to remain uncovered, or fight for justice, no matter the consequences. I wasn't going to stay silent. I needed to find proof that his influential connections played a role in this crime. I gathered all the facts I could find and passed them to my lawyer. We began preparing the case, certain that this information was crucial. Now that I knew who was truly guilty and what forces were trying to cover up the truth, I was ready to fight to the end. Matt and Laura didn't deserve for their deaths to be written off as an accident. This was a crime, and no one, not even an influential person, should get away with it. I sat in the lawyer's office, unable to believe what I had just heard. The words he spoke, slowly sinking in, wouldn't leave me. He explained that despite all our efforts and the evidence we had gathered, new details were emerging in the case that were throwing everything into question. The influential man behind the wheel of the car turned out to be far from an ordinary person. He was more connected with high-profile figures than I could have imagined. Each word from the lawyer echoed in my ears, and I could feel my doubts growing. He spoke of political pressure, how often such cases were swept under the rug when powerful people were involved. This was no longer just a legal case. It was much more complicated than I had thought. I didn't know what to do next. The inspiration and resolve that had driven me throughout the investigation began to fade. How could I fight this? How could I fight a system that protected those who were guilty just because they were influential? I felt helpless, like my efforts were in vain, and the truth would never come to light. The lawyer noticed my silence and, perhaps, realized that I was losing confidence. He shook his head, stood up, and began pacing around the office. "Don't give up," he said, walking over to me. "This isn't the end. We have every reason to keep fighting. We just need to find other ways. We need to push harder, show that it doesn't matter how influential someone is, truth can't be hidden." I felt his words strengthen my resolve a little. I looked at him, and in his eyes I saw the confidence I was lacking. He wasn't giving up, and I realized I couldn't give up either. Matt and Laura deserved for their deaths not to go unpunished. I couldn't be the one to let it slide. I took a deep breath, stood up from the table, and focused on continuing the fight. The problems I had encountered were just temporary obstacles. I knew the path would be long and difficult, but I couldn't stop. All I had to do was find the loopholes, find a vulnerability, and then I could bring those behind this crime into the light. "Let's keep going," I said, looking firmly into the lawyer's eyes. "It's not over. We're going to fight." The lawyer nodded, and in his gaze, I felt strength and support. We were ready to walk this path, and I knew that if I had to fight the system, I would fight to the end. When I got home, everything was quiet. Quiet like a grave. I sat in the chair, holding the documents that confirmed my suspicions. This wasn't just an investigation, it was the beginning of my fight for justice. I knew that now, as I was getting closer to the truth, it would be hard to keep going. But I couldn't stop. Matt and Laura deserved this. I picked up the phone and started going through the records, checking if everything was in order with my latest steps when, unexpectedly, the phone rang. An unfamiliar number. My heart tightened, but I picked up the call. "Benjamin," a low voice said on the other end, its tone leaving no room for doubt. This wasn't just a call. This was a warning. "I advise you to stop what you've started. You're digging too deep, and it will end badly for you." I froze. His voice was calm, but it had so much threat in it that I felt a chill run down my spine. "Who is this?" I couldn't hide my unease. "It doesn't matter," he replied with a barely noticeable smirk. "What matters is that if you continue to search for the truth, the consequences will be catastrophic. You shouldn't be digging where you're not wanted. Make sure your steps don't lead to tragedy for you and your loved ones." I could feel the adrenaline rushing through me. I knew this was a threat. An unpleasant, outright threat. But something inside me snapped. I couldn't let these people dictate what I should do. "I've already lost everything I could," I said, trying to keep calm, but there was firmness in my voice. "And I won't stop until I get justice." On the other end, there was silence. For a few seconds, I could hear nothing but soft breathing. Then his voice cut through the stillness again. "This will be your last mistake, Benjamin. Don't say we didn't warn you." With those words, he hung up. I sat in the silence, not believing what I had just felt. But the sense of unease wouldn't leave me. I knew that now, if I continued, I would be stepping into dangerous territory where there would be no turning back. But I couldn't stop. This wasn't just my choice, it was my duty. I held the phone, but my hand was starting to shake. Everything I had just heard didn't make sense. The ghostly voice with threats continued echoing in my ears. I couldn't just sit and wait for everything to resolve itself. It was too serious to ignore. I dialed the lawyer's number, not thinking about anything but what I needed to do. "Hello?" a voice answered on the other end. "It's me, Benjamin." "You won't believe what just happened," I said, trying to keep the panic rising inside me out of my voice. The lawyer on the other end went silent. I knew he had already understood what I was talking about. "Something happened?" he asked, and I felt the concern in his voice. "Did you find something out?" I told him everything that had happened. How I'd received the call, how I was warned, and how now they were threatening me to stop. I heard him sigh, his breathing growing heavier. "You need to be careful, Benjamin," the lawyer said, his voice now much more cautious. "They've started threatening you. And if they're acting like this, it means they're serious. You might want to back off. I'm not sure we can move forward without consequences. This could be dangerous for all of us." These words exploded inside me. Surrender? I couldn't. Matt and Laura didn't deserve to have everything swept under the rug. I felt the blood boil in my veins as rage started to overtake me. "No, I won't stop," I said, gripping my throat. "I'll do whatever it takes to bring this to an end. You've helped me, and I'll pay for your help, whatever it takes. This isn't just about money, it's about justice. I can't let this go, understand?" I heard him pause for a few seconds, and his words gave me a bit of hope. "Are you serious? You want to go all the way?" he asked, surprise in his voice. "Are you ready to risk everything?" "I'm ready to risk everything, if necessary," I'll offer all my savings, everything I have. I'll do it to make sure this doesn't go unpunished. You can't back down. On the other end, I heard a heavy sigh, then footsteps, as if he was thinking it over. I know someone who can help us, the lawyer said, suddenly sounding like he had an epiphany. I have an old acquaintance who has connections that even these people won't be able to stop. He'll help us. We'll take this case to the next level. I felt my heart stop. My resolve grew with every passing second. I was ready to pay the price for the truth. But now I had a chance I couldn't miss. Tell me what we need to do. I'm ready for any risks, I replied, gritting my teeth. All right, Benjamin, the lawyer said. I'll reach out to him. He's helped in situations like this before. If anyone can help us get out of this situation, it's him. I sighed with relief, but I knew this was only the first step. With every moment, I was getting closer to the point where I would have to make a choice between what I was willing to do and what was going to happen next. But I knew I couldn't turn back now. I stared out the car window at the dark city. My gaze was fixed on one point, but inside, everything was boiling. I knew that now, having come so close to the truth, everything would start moving faster, and the further I went, the harder it would be to stop. I had the proof that the driver was drunk behind the wheel, and I knew who could help me reach the top of all this. But I also understood that now, after stepping over this line, there would be no turning back. I left the lawyer and his old acquaintance to handle the legal matters, but I had to meet with the person who could lead me to the highest circles of this game. A person who was ready to help me achieve justice. But before that, I had one last step to take. When I arrived at the building, my heart started pounding. It was in a secluded part of town, away from the familiar areas. This moment, meeting the person who could change everything. I stopped the car without thinking, opened the door, and stepped out. My thoughts were clear, and my steps were decisive. I was ready. Walking up the stairs, I suddenly realized this wasn't just an investigation, it was a real fight against the system. It was more than just uncovering the truth, it was about destroying the world that allowed these criminals to remain invisible. When I entered the office, the man I had been waiting for was standing there, the old acquaintance of the lawyer. He was confident, but I saw wariness in his eyes. He knew this wouldn't be easy. He knew what I was getting into. You came, he said, nodding toward a chair. I can help, but you need to understand, we're taking risks. If they sense we're close, they'll do everything to stop us. I sat down across from him, not breaking eye contact. My decision had already been made. We can't back down, I said. I won't stop until these people are held accountable. He looked at me closely, and there was a new expression in his eyes, resolve. Then be ready. We need to act fast. We have a few days to gather all the evidence and expose them. They won't sit idly by. If they feel threatened, they'll just wipe us out. I nodded. Those words were a signal to act. Everything I had been through up until now had led me to this moment. I was ready. There was no room for doubt anymore. I stood up, and although I knew it would be tough, I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't stop until I revealed the whole truth. The trial wasn't easy. It became clear as soon as the case went to court. Every step, every new document, every hearing felt like a battle. It was impossible to avoid the constant pressure, from the lawyers, from those trying to bury the case, from outside forces. Each session made me feel like the walls were closing in, like this was all a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. But I knew I couldn't back down. Every day felt like a new battle. I watched as the prosecution, despite all their efforts, couldn't hide the facts. Their experts tried to discredit the evidence. Their witnesses couldn't definitively confirm all the accusations, but I kept believing in the truth. I knew that if I didn't give up, if I insisted on every fact, I would eventually get what I wanted. But it wasn't easy. I saw how the defendants' lawyers tried to wiggle out of it, how they played the system's weaknesses. They tried to blame everyone, police, experts, witnesses, me. It felt like a game, one in which every move the opponent made was to try to make me lose my resolve. But I couldn't back down. I saw their eyes. I knew that if I let them win, Matt and Laura, my family, they would never get justice. On the day of the final trial, I felt like everything around me slowed down. The judge at the table, the prosecutor, the defense attorneys, they were all speaking, but I could only hear one voice in my head. Don't give up. I knew that this moment would decide everything. All those weeks, all those days when I thought I might lose everything, they were for this. When it was time for the final verdict, I felt the tension hit its peak. The judge took his seat, and for a moment, it seemed like the whole world froze. He spoke, his voice firm, but all this time, I couldn't help but think what would happen if they once again managed to hide the truth. Guilty, the judge said, and those words became a moment when everything went silent. The defendant's lawyer's eyes were filled with shock and rage. They didn't expect that this time, they wouldn't be able to wiggle out of it. I couldn't believe it, but at the same time, I felt the heavy weight lift off me. This moment was like liberation. The defendant was sentenced. Not just any punishment, it was justice for which I had fought. He was found guilty of the crash, of taking the lives of Matt and Laura. The judge's sentence confirmed that even those who thought they could remain unpunished would not escape responsibility. I didn't feel relief. Maybe it was because the price for this moment had been too high. But I knew I had done everything to get to the truth. I knew now that I could, at least in part, ease my pain because I hadn't given up. I was able to bring justice and restore the memory of those I loved. Now, it was all behind me. The defendant had been punished, and I had regained the peace that was taken from me. Matt and Laura wouldn't come back, but I was able to make sure their death wasn't left without consequence. And in that, there was meaning in everything I went through. The trial was over. The guilty party had been punished, and despite all the difficulties, I had achieved justice. It wasn't just a victory, it was the restoration of what had been destroyed. Matt and Laura, although they wouldn't return, could now rest peacefully, knowing that their deaths hadn't gone unanswered. I felt relief, but at the same time, there was emptiness. It was hard to feel joy when you've lost so much. Returning home, I felt a strange sense of desolation. Everything was just as it had been before all of this started, the same rooms, the same silence. But something inside me had changed, and I knew I could never go back to the way things were. I sat in the chair I had spent so many hours in, the one I would sit in to talk with Laura. She wasn't coming back, and I felt the weight of loneliness settle in. I knew I had done everything I could to seek justice, but it didn't bring complete relief. The cost of the truth had been too high. Justice had been restored, and while that was important, I couldn't shake the feeling of loss. I couldn't get back what had been lost, and I understood that, despite all my efforts, much of what I had gone through would never be forgotten. But I knew that, at least, something had been done right, and that thought gave me the strength to move forward.